notes. I'll put my email up at the end, and just send me an email and I can email them back to people. That'd be absolutely fine. Particularly this afternoon, I have a slight tendency, as my brother always winds me up, to slightly over-prepare. So there's probably way more slides than we'll really look at in detail. And so, again, if I send you the PowerPoint, you can always have a look through some of them yourselves another time. Particularly with other reading, there might be books on there you're interested in. Excellent. So what we're going to look at now is this idea of drawing near to the presence of God, looking at the worship of God in Revelation 4 and 5. So what happens in chapters 4 and 5 of the Book of Revelation, and we'll look at this together, is that John, the seer, ascends to the heavenly temple in a vision. So he ascends to the heavenly temple where God is enthroned, and he sees this kind of worship of God in this heavenly liturgy, the temple in heaven. And then that's chapter 4. Then in chapter 5 you get the image of the Lamb, Christ portrayed as a lamb, who's presented to the one on the throne and the scroll. And then there's worship of both the one on the throne and the Lamb. So it's this idea of the worship of God, both the one on the throne and the Lamb, in chapters 4 and 5. So we'll look at a little bit of that together. And it links back to that point. Do you remember we looked at just before the end of the morning session, where I tried to persuade you, I'm not sure if I convinced you all, that what the Book of Revelation is all about is about worshipping God and following Christ, imitating Christ. So we're mainly focusing in the afternoon session on this idea of worshipping God. Worship God is what this book is all about. And that's both God and the Lamb, this idea of God not just being the one on the throne, but this notion of Christ also as God. So John the seer enters into the presence of God, the one on the throne and the Lamb, by means of a visionary ascent to the heavenly temple. So how might we then draw nearer to the presence of God? We're not arrested. With the Apocalypse. And there was a number of other passages which came to mind. I thought, well, we can't do everything in one day. So I'm just going to pick out 2 ways in which this text might help us draw nearer to the presence of God. There may be other passages we could look at which would help us think of other things. But this notion of worshipping God, I thought, well, let's look at that. So 2 ways. First of all, the visionary narrative affords us, as hearers of this text, so like the original audience, this text will be read aloud and they will listen to it, with a privileged glimpse of the heavenly realm. The Apocalypse discloses to us the seer's vision of the presence of God in heaven, with its effective power to move us by seeing again what he saw. Directions to the heavenly temple. So let's do it. So this first point, this idea of one of the things that the Book of Revelation can help us do, because we ourselves may not be visionaries, able to see visions of God in heaven, but this text has written down, this text that we can read and hear, so we can see again what John saw. So although we ourselves maybe can't have a glimpse of the heavenly realm ourselves in a vision, we're able to read or hear this text and get a sense of this vision of God. So it's seeing again or hearing again what John saw. And do you remember how the text opens? Revelation chapter 1 verse 3. Blessed are those who hear the words of this prophecy. So when you hear this text being read aloud, you're being given this privileged glimpse, this disclosure, apocalypsis, this revelation of who God is through this glimpse of God in the heavenly temple. So that's one element, through reading the text, hearing it being read aloud. The other part is we can't just stop there, because the other thing the text wants us to do is kind of hear and obey, hear and listen. And so you don't just read about God being worshipped in the heavenly temple, but you should worship God too. Do you remember, the key to this text is worship God. It's not just read about God being worshipped, worship God yourselves. So the visionary narrative in Revelation 4 to 5 also discloses the liturgy of the heavenly temple. Believers can enter into this heavenly liturgy now, on earth, by joining in with the praise of the angelic host. So this idea of worship on earth is a way of joining with the angels of worship of God in heaven. It's not just something you have to wait for when you go to heaven to worship God. It's something you can do now. And it's this way of connecting up kind of in worship, in liturgy, so in worship of God on earth and worship of God in heaven. It's kind of living the future now. This idea of when you're going to kind of a worship service, particularly thinking maybe of Eucharist, but worship services in general, that you're joining with the heavenly temple in worship. Worship of God, the Creator and Redeemer, in unison with the heavenly liturgy, enables believers to draw nearer to the presence of God already in this present time. Hearers of this text are encouraged to join in with the worship of God in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Do you see Revelation 1:10? When does this vision occur? It occurs on the Lord's Day. And that might also link with this idea of the recurring sevens. It's a bit like the Sabbath, the seventh day. The Lord's Day is the seventh day. It's this recurrence of worship on the seventh day. So what's this text trying to get us to do? How might we draw nearer to the presence of God? Just to sort of summarise what I was saying there. Two ways we can do it. There's more are available, I think, but two are the ones we're going to look at today. By prayerfully hearing or reading this text and reflecting upon its rich theological imagery and symbolism, so as to meditate upon the vision of the triune God that it offers. And that's one of the things we'll be looking at this afternoon, trying to look at some of the imagery of the text and see how it presents God, the God to be worshipped. Reading or hearing this text together. The second point, as I said, you can't end there, and this is where the singing comes in later. By worshipping the triune God in liturgy, joining in the praise of God in unison with the heavenly host. So it's not just a case of reading the text and saying, oh, that's very nice, God is being worshipped. That was a nice passage. It's that you're meant to do that too, that you join in with this worship. So it's a hearing and doing. Remember Revelation 1:3. Blessed are those who hear the words of this prophecy and observe or keep what's written in it. You have to hear the text, but then also do what it says. So it's a hearing and doing. So is that okay? That's what we'll be looking at this afternoon. It's this idea of the worship of God. How is God portrayed in the heavenly liturgy in Revelation 4 and 5? And then encouraging us to join in with that worship. So just as the angels in heaven are worshipping God, we too can join in with that worship on earth. So you don't just have to wait to heaven at the end, but you can do it now already. So is that all right? Excellent. I put various images. This is from William Blake. So we're going to look at Revelation 4 and 5, and they're very rich passages, enormous amounts going on. And so I've mostly focused on the worship bits, the hymns. I said that this text is absolutely full of hymns. Right the way through the text, again and again and again, you get this text full of hymns and worship and liturgy. It's also a very noisy text. Everyone's shouting and saying things in a loud voice. So we'll look first at chapter 4, Revelation chapter 4. We'll work through some of the passage together. Just to give you a sense of what's going on, the first few verses of Revelation chapter 4, you get John the seer ascend into the heavenly temple in the Spirit. So he ascends in a vision to the heavenly temple and sees the worship of God that's going on in the heavenly temple. So it's a vision of the heavenly temple or throne room. And what you get within the Book of Revelation and lots of other prophetic texts, how does it envision heaven? It describes heaven as being like a temple or a throne room. It's where God dwells. It's this image of a heavenly temple. So if you go up in a vision to the heavenly temple, what do you see? You see the worship of God in this temple, the angels all around it. So that's what's then described in the middle bit, verses 2 to 7. Various different characters we might touch on a little bit. But my main focus then will be verses 8 till 11, the heavenly worship itself that's described. And in particular the holy, holy, holy. We'll look in more detail at that. This idea of praising the one on the throne. So that's what we're going to focus upon. So if you see here, I should explain before I show you the pictures. I said before, ways in which it can help you understand these texts are to see passages that are similar to what's going on in Revelation 4. And there's two or three passages in particular that are quite insightful. One of them is from Isaiah, chapter 6, where you get this vision of the prophet. Again, you see the vision of the heavenly temple and the Lord being worshipped. And you get Ezekiel chapter 1, very, very famous throne chariot visions. We'll touch on those by way of background, and other passages in Daniel, but we'll just focus on those two. So this is there'll be a drawing that I do later on, and you'll see from my 5-year-old's primary school drawing that this wasn't me. So anything that looks remotely professional wasn't me, sadly. So this is a scholar called Otmar Kiel, and he's done a lot of studies of the Psalms and the imageries in the Psalms in particular. And he's just trying to show kind of stylized version, really, of Isaiah chapter 6, this image of the kind of seraphim worshipping God in the heavenly temple. Let me passage, shall I point out one or two things? Oh, look, I can do a little thing. There we go. So you've got, this is the heavenly realm, so this is the cherubim throne. It's the idea of the throne of God in heaven. Cherubim are a bit like kind of sphinx type creatures. These are the seraphim. Originally in Egyptian iconography, the seraph, it was kind of the burning one. They were like kind of snake-like figure. But by the period we're looking at, the seraphim are understood as almost angelic figures. But this is earlier Egyptian iconography. And so you've got the heavenly throne, where God is being worshipped, and then you've got the mini version on earth, which is the temple. It's like a microcosm of the heavenly realm. So if you look at Isaiah chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty. So it's a vision of the Lord enthroned. And the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. So you've got this idea of, as I said, by the time the Book of Revelation is written, these will be understood as kind of angelic figures that are in attendance in the presence of God. And this is then describing the kind of words of the heavenly liturgy in Isaiah 6, a very famous passage. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So you've got this image in Isaiah 6 of the prophet seeing a vision of the Lord enthroned in the temple. It's a little bit ambiguous whether it's the earthly temple or the heavenly temple. But you've got these seraphim, these kind of angelic attendants, praising the Lord, and you get the actual lyrics. Holy, 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 this kind of hymn of praise of the Lord in the heavenly temple. And this will be really important for background for the Book of Revelation chapter 4. Something very similar to this will be described in Revelation 4. So it's seeing again something we've seen before in the prophets, in Isaiah. Is that okay? Is people reasonably clear? So it's this idea of something we'll see again in chapter 4. If you've read Isaiah and you've read Daniel and you've read Ezekiel and these other texts before, you'll hear echoes of it, you'll see kind of connections with it. The other passage then, I won't read the whole thing, is from Ezekiel chapter 1. Again, a very, very famous image. Again, it's of the Lord on his throne chariot. But what happens in Ezekiel chapter 1 is that the chariot moves, it leaves the temple and comes to the land of exile. So this is kind of mobile chariot throne. So it's a throne with wheels. So it's the Lord leaving the temple, the presence of God leaving the temple at the time of the exile, and going into the land of exile. But what you get in Ezekiel, a very famous passage, again is a depiction of the Lord in his throne chariot. And you've got this, again, a little bit like the Otmarkeel image. It's like a miniature version of God enthroned. And above the dome over their heads, there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was something that seemed like a human form. Upwards from what appeared like loins, I saw something like gleaming amber, something that looked like fire enclosed all around. And that bit's important, this way this human figure is described, kind of a glorified figure. And downwards from what looked like the loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was splendour all around. So it's trying to give you an image of the glorified image of God enthroned. Like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of the splendour all around. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. So again, these are two very, very famous images within the prophetic scripture, the Old Testament, of the Lord enthroned. The Lord as King enthroned, as this kind of glorified Lord of hosts. Isaiah chapter 6 and Ezekiel chapter 1. And the image you're going to get in Revelation 4 has a lot of similarities to these. So if you were living in the first century and you hear the Book of Revelation being read out, it reminds you of these passages. It reminds you of these earlier visions of the Lord enthroned. Is that okay? Is that okay? And here's just an image of a cherubim throne. Again, cherubim were a bit like a kind of sphinx-like figure. And here's William Blake's take on it. This cherubim throne from Ezekiel. So we'll look now at Revelation chapter 4. As I said, having in our mind's eye the background of these texts we've just heard. So this is Revelation chapter 4. At once I was in the Spirit, so this is John the seer, and there in heaven stood a throne. So again, that's familiar, that's what you expect to see. If you've seen a vision of the Lord in heaven, you expect him to be on the throne, a glorified figure, with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian. And around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Do you remember from Ezekiel, we just had that image of something like a rainbow around the throne. And you can see straight away there's similarities with Ezekiel and Isaiah of the Lord enthroned, this glorified figure of the Lord. But unlike in the book of Ezekiel, for example, where it describes him as like a human-like figure, in the book of Revelation it doesn't describe that at all. It just compares God to being like these gemstones, jasper and carnelian. So we don't exactly know. Some of these come in various colours, but I think the idea is they're meant to be kind of reddish. Do you remember the passage from Isaiah and Ezekiel talked about kind of burning up fiery flames? It's this notion of the glory of the Lord, this kind of radiance of the Lord. And what the book of Revelation does is it doesn't want to describe God in kind of human form. It talks about God as being like these gemstones, trying to give you a sense of this glory, radiance of the Lord, comparing the Lord to these various gemstones. And you get those gemstones elsewhere within the book of Revelation, in the New Jerusalem, where it talks about the glory of the Lord. And also a number of these gemstones come back in the book of Exodus. They were the gemstones that the high priest would have on his medallion, or his ephod on his front. So what you've got there, the opening of this passage, it's similar to Isaiah 6, it's similar to Ezekiel 1. It's the Lord enthroned, the glorified image of the Lord. And yet it's trying not to express something even human-like. It's trying to use these images of gemstones to talk about the radiance of the Lord. But it's picking up things we've seen similarly before. We continue on then with Revelation 4. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white robes, with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Around the throne, and on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with a face like a human face, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. And again, we didn't read the whole of Ezekiel earlier, Ezekiel chapter 1, but do you remember we talked about this image of the throne chariot? And again, the figures on the throne chariot are very similar to what you get within the book of Revelation there, with this lion, ox, human and eagle figure, but each one of them had all those 4 faces. In Revelation you've got 4 different kind of characters. But what's being described in the book of Revelation really is this image of the heavenly temple. The heavenly temple is being described. And if I just show you some pictures, this will hopefully start to make a little bit more sense. There's some very good resources. In particular, there's a Bible Atlas, ESV Bible Atlas, extraordinarily good atlas. It's got beautiful pictures, very good as an atlas as well, but wonderful images of the temples and those things that artists have drawn. And when you'll see my drawing of a 5-year-old's child's drawing, you'll see why I'm quite grateful that other people can draw properly. So what you get within the book of Revelation, sorry if I just skip this forward, is an image in Revelation 4 of the heavenly temple. And items that you get within the temple, either of the wilderness tent, you know, the one that went through the wilderness with Moses, or later Jerusalem, the temple. It's like a living version of that. It's the heavenly original, and this is like the copy, this is like the earthly copy, is what you get with the tent of witness or the Jerusalem temple. So this is an image of the wilderness tent, the one they carried through the wilderness, and just a slightly more zoomed in version of it. So various different aspects of it. Do you see at the back there you get this idea of the cherubim throne, this kind of cherubim throne where the Ark of the Covenant is. Those kind of living creatures that we had from Ezekiel, it's like a living version of that, the cherubim throne come to life and moving. So similarly you get that in the book of Revelation. And you get this idea of the 7 kind of spirits, the 7 lamps in the book of Revelation. Again, that's an image almost like the lampstand come to life, these 7 flames before the presence of the Lord. So what you get within Revelation chapter 4 is a kind of a version of the temple that you get on earth, but the original temple, the living temple, not an earthly copy. So things you get in the earthly temple that are inanimate objects, in the heavenly temple they're real angelic figures worshipping God. So again, some of those things, as I mentioned, like the Ark of the Covenant or the lampstand, they kind of are living angelic beings in the heavenly temple, whereas in the earthly model they're kind of little inanimate objects. So this is my drawing now. So you can see the level has somewhat dropped. I can only do things on a computer, mostly like Etch-a-Sketch. And so it looks like a child has drawn it. So this is meant to be the heaven in the Book of Revelation, which sadly looks like a 24-hour clock, which is very depressing. But the key point to notice, if you read through Revelation 4 again, is it's a kind of a circular model, a concentric model, and the holier you get is at the centre. God is enthroned at the centre, and as you move further out, it's getting less and less holy. So the holiest bit, the equivalent to the Holy of Holies. Do you remember in this model, the further you go in, this is the holy place. That's the holy place at the front where the priest can go, but only once a year can the high priest go into the Holy of Holies at the back. So the holier you go into the temple, the further back you go. In Book of Revelation, it's more central. God is enthroned at the centre, and then you get the various other angels encircling him. So the further out you go, the less holy it's getting. So what this is meant to be, so this is the throne at the centre. These are the 4 cherubim around the throne. So this living cherubim throne. Then you've got things like the altar of incense in front of him. The 7 kind of spirits, the 7 angels, who are kind of like a living version of the lampstand. And then you've got the 24 elders around the edge. So that's the bit that makes it look like a clock sound. And then you've got angels further out again. You've got these kind of thousands and thousands of angels further out. So the further out you get from the centre, the further away you are from God enthroned at the centre. So essentially it's like the Holy of Holies is right in the middle. The closer you get to the middle, the holier it's getting. Which is going to be very important when you look at chapter 5 and where the land is in Revelation chapter 5. Is that all? Is that reasonably clear? Or have I completely thrown you? Yeah. Well.
24. What about the rest of this?
Yeah. I mean, you get in a later chapter. It talks about those robed in white who are on the sea of glass, standing, kind of singing on the sea of glass. They seem to be kind of in between the elders and the throne. They seem to be in this kind of grey bit. They're on kind of the sea of glass. They seem to be doing okay. You've also got those martyrs who are under the throne, and so they're kind of more around here. So you've got them in that kind of heavenly temple as well. Because what you'll get, one of the images that's used of the people of God in Revelation is priests. That's what the priest image is all about. It's access to God. How close can you get to God? And you can be part of the heavenly temple, so you can worship in the heavenly temple. Yeah, so although they're not described, they do on the kind of sea of, I can't remember which chapter now. It's, I can't remember. But where they're described as standing on the sea of glass, 14 maybe. So they'd be, I said, oops, that was the wrong button. So on this bit, the sea of glass is that bit in between the 24 elders and the throne. So the idea you'd be kind of priests in the heavenly temple, which is quite nice, isn't it? And then the bit I'm going to focus on, so that was just by way of giving you an image, which I hope I haven't confused you too much about. But the notion of what you've got is heaven imagined as a temple. At the centre is God on the throne, then you've got the cherubim. Slightly further out, you've got the 24 elders, then you've got the broader kind of thousands and thousands of angels. They're more like the general priests in heaven. And you've got this praise to God that's occurring. And do you remember we read a little bit earlier Isaiah 6, the Holy, Holy, Holy. So this is going to be really crucial now in Revelation, where you've got this kind of hymn of praise. In Revelation chapter 4, verses 8 to 11, the contents of the eternal heavenly liturgy are described. It's this unceasing. It's been going on since the beginning of time. The worship commences with the song of the 4 living creatures that surround the throne, echoing the song of the seraphim of Isaiah 6. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and inside. Day and night without ceasing they sing. And you can see it's echoing Isaiah 6. Holy, 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 the Lord God the Almighty, who was and is to come. Do people notice, we'll look in a second, but do people already notice where that's particularly different from the Isaiah 6 one we read earlier? You might not remember that. Is it the first line or the second line? Do you think that's the second line? It's the first line, the holy, 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 the Lord God of hosts, or the Lord God Almighty, that's pretty much the same. It's the second line that's different, and that's what we're going to focus on now. Because that's at the key of understanding the Book of Revelation is this second line. This description of the praise of God that's been going on eternally in the heavenly temples since the beginning of time. This unceasing worship of God. So this is a very, very famous passage, referred to in various different terms in Greek and Hebrew and Latin. You'll note from Latin it's the Sanctus, the holy, holy, holy. In Hebrew it's called the Kedusha, Kadosh in Hebrew is holy. The Tris Hagion in Greek, Hagios is the Greek word for holy. So it's this repeated holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. So we've already spoke a little bit there about how is it different. And it's particularly the second line. This was the Isaiah 6 line, so it's similar but different. And that's why if you read the Old Testament passage, and then you see how it's similar and different, it's already beginning to draw out a layer of meaning. You're going, that's like what was going on in Isaiah 6, but there's something different. What was different? What's new? What's changed? How is this being described as different? And we've got the earth is full of his glory in Isaiah 6. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The earth is full of his glory. So both begin with the holy, 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 whereas the second part changes. Isaiah 6, verse 3, describes the glory of the Lord filling the earth, whereas Revelation 4:8 focuses on a detailed description of the divine name. Who is God? God is eternal, existing in the past, the present, and the future. Why does John refer to the future, coming of the Lord, rather than God's future being? Why not say who was and is and will be? We'll look at that now in just a second. So this is what we're going to focus on. There's two things really in the worship of chapters 4 and 5 we're going to focus in particular on, and this is the first one from chapter 4. We're going to look at this holy, 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 and he who was and who is to come. Because it's going to get to the very heart of Revelation's understanding of who God is. So there will be a few little technical bits. I'll refer to the odd bit of Greek or whatever, but don't panic. The key thing is, if we understand this, it's like a little key that suddenly you see things you hadn't seen before in Revelation. And this is going to take us back to Moses and the burning bush. So this image of he who was, who is, and who is to come. In order to understand it, we first need to go back again into Scripture and look at Moses and the burning bush. So a passage we're familiar with, but let's remind ourselves of it. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. It's this crucially important passage within the Old Testament of Moses meeting God at the burning bush. And what follows from that in Exodus 3, we'll see in just a moment, is a reflection on who is God, the name of God, who is God, the being of God. And the key passage is Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. One of the most famous passages in Scripture. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And then we get this revelation of God's name. God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. So this is Exodus 3:14, the revelation of the name of God. And it's going to be a passage that Jewish thinkers in the first century, including the author of Revelation, are going to pick up and reflect upon. This idea of the name of God from Exodus 3:14. So Exodus 3:14 discloses an interpretation of the divine name the sacred name of God, comprised of 4 Hebrew consonants.